This morning we're going to discuss the Akedah Yitzchak, the very famous story of the binding of Isaac, when God told Abraham to please take Isaac and bring him as a sacrifice on this distant mountain. Very, very problematic story, interesting story. Some of our tradition considers Abraham the knight of faith, great faith, that even though God gave him this very difficult commandment, Abraham was willing to do it because God commanded him. Other people are troubled by it. Why did Abraham be willing to sacrifice his son when God was going to destroy Sodom and Amorah? Abraham spoke up against it. He argued with God. How come he didn't argue when his own son was being put at risk? Many stories about this, many interpretations of this story. When I was a little boy, I remember very vaguely, as a dim memory of a little boy growing up in Seattle at Ezra B'Sareth Synagogue, the synagogue of the Rodezli Jews. The first day they would sing the Echari Ratzon, which is this poem about the Akedah. They would sing it in Hebrew. And the second day they would sing it in Ladino. And they sang it in Ladino because that's the language all the ladies understood. The ladies weren't so fluent in Hebrew in those days, but Ladino they understood, the older ladies. And I remember just perfectly that the ladies, they used to be sobbing in the synagogue. I remember my mother, who didn't come to synagogue that regularly. She was a very pious woman, but didn't come to synagogue too often. Women didn't come too often in those days. But they all would cry because this was a sad story, such a moving story, that Abraham, poor fellow, is bringing his son and he's going to sacrifice him. And the poetry is so beautiful. And it really stretches every emotion of yours when you listen to that beautiful Echari Ratzon song. So that's the way the story has played out in history and in our tradition. And I'm not going to argue with that. That's part of our tradition. But if I look at the story more carefully, I find a whole different meaning in it. And I might be right, I might be wrong, but you're stuck listening to me, so I'll try to give you my explanation of it. If you go to the story itself and look at it carefully, we have to look at it in context. And the story begins as follows. It's chapter 22 in Genesis. After all of these things, Elohim Nisad Abraham, God tested Abraham. What kind of test? First of all, does God need to test Abraham? God knows if Abraham has faith or doesn't have faith. God knows. So the general interpretation is God made Abraham a nace, made Abraham like a flag. God wanted to take Abraham and put him on a pedestal as a model of what faith is. And he says, Abraham, and here's Hine, I'm here. And God says, Kach nat bincha, take your son, et yechidcha, your only son, asher ahavta, that you loved, et Yitzchak. And then you go to this mountain. That's very interesting. Why did God give so many preliminaries? To say, take your son Yitzchak. So okay, let's look at it more carefully. If you remember, Abraham had two sons at this point in his life. He didn't just have Yitzchak, he had Ishmael. And if you recall the story, which happened just a chapter before this, Abraham loved Ishmael. Ishmael was his firstborn son. Ishmael was strong. Ishmael could beat up Yitzchak. Ishmael was a tough guy. Abraham loved Ishmael. Sarah forced him to throw Ishmael and Hagar out. And it says, Vayera hadavar ma'od b'nei Avraham. Abraham was bitter about it. He did not want to get rid of Ishmael. He loved Ishmael. And when God said, I'm going to make, you're going to have a child through Sarah, and that child will be your descendant, will take over for you. Abraham says, Lu Yishmael yechia lefanecha. God, I don't need another son. I have a son. Let Ishmael be the son. So when God comes and says, Abraham, take your son, Abraham says, just a second. I have two sons. Okay, I threw Ishmael out, but my heart is still with him. I haven't given up on him. So the God says, Et yechidcha, your only son. Abraham says, he's not my only son, God. What are you talking about? I don't have an only son. I have two sons. Asher ahavta, the one that you love. Hey, I love Ishmael too. Et Yitzchak. Finally, I'm talking about Isaac. So he had to go through a process. I think what's happening here is God, this story has to hark back to the original story of Ishmael. And without understanding Abraham's relationship with Ishmael, it seems to me, the story of the Akedah doesn't make full sense. If we understand that this was a test of Abraham, not a test of Abraham's faith in God. God knew Abraham has faith in God. It's a test, does Abraham appreciate his son Yitzchak? In other words, Abraham has two sons, and he has to have a successor. And if you were Abraham, who would you pick as your successor? A strong, tough, rowdy kid or a little wimpy kid. You would not, most people would pick the tough kid, Ishmael. He's older, he's stronger, he has more ability, he could be a much greater leader, it seems. God is saying, no. I want you to appreciate Yitzhak. Yitzhak is quieter. Yitzhak isn't as powerful as Ishmael, but Yitzhak has other qualities, spiritual qualities, and I want your descendants to carry the spiritual qualities. If you think carefully, look ahead to the next generation, we have the same problem with Yaakov. He had two sons, right? Yitzhak had two sons, Esav and Yaakov. He liked Esav. Why? Because Esav was strong. Yaakov was quiet. Yaakov was shyer. The natural tendency is to favor the stronger son. And God is trying to tell us, don't go by physical strength. Look at the spiritual power of the person. So God says, okay, I want you to take Yitzhak, your son Yitzhak, and I want you to bring him to this mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him. Now, why didn't God just say, go down the block and sacrifice him? Go half a mile down. 3 days journey. What's going on? Why do you need 3 days? And why did God say, to the mountain that I will show you? Why did God say, give him a specific address? God is, the test to Abraham is, Abraham, I want you to spend 3 days camping out with your son. You'll have a chance to talk to him. You'll have a chance to get to know him. You've underestimated his abilities. You've underestimated him as your successor. I want you to be able to spend time with him, talk with him. You spend 3 days. You'll have a barbecue along the way. You'll eat. You'll get to know this kid. So they go for 3 days, and Abraham obviously doesn't learn his lesson. And when they come to the mountain, they come to the mountain, and Abraham right away fixes up the altar, and he puts the wood on the altar, and he ties Yitzhak on the altar. Vayishlach Avraham et yado, and Avraham picked up his hand. Vayikach et ha'ma'achelet, he picked up a knife. L'shchot et beno, he has a knife to his son's throat. And then the Torah says, Vayikra elav malach Adonai min hashamayim, and an angel from the Lord calls out to Abraham, Avraham, Avraham. Now in the Hebrew notation, he says Avraham, and then there's a pasek. Avraham, what do we read it? Avraham, Avraham, there's a break. What does it mean? It means something happened. There was a transformation in Abraham. The Abraham before the Akedah was different from the Abraham after the Akedah. Only when Abraham had his knife at the throat of his son did he stop. Only then did the angel stop him. What really happened? Yes, the traditional interpretation is that God saw how faithful he was willing to sacrifice his son, and God said, okay, stop, I don't want you to sacrifice your son. I don't believe in child sacrifice. You passed the test. That's the correct way, that's the traditional way. I see it a different way. Once Abraham actually had the knife at his son's throat, he suddenly realized, what am I going to lose here? I underestimated this kid. Oh my God, I'm going to kill my own son. How am I going to live with myself after this? Abraham before the knife at his throat was different from the Abraham after the knife on the throats. So what did Abraham learn? He wasn't learning faith in God. He had faith in God. What he's learning is faith in Yitzhak. Sometimes we don't appreciate what we have until we're about to lose it, or until we lost it. Many times, if you go to funerals, rabbis go to funerals over the years, and people, oh, I wish I would have done this. Oh, I wish I would have done that. Oh, I wish I would have known better. Oh, I wish I would have tried harder. Yeah, it's too late. But until you lose somebody, you don't know how valuable the person was. Suddenly you wake up. That's what happened. Abraham with the knife at the son's throat before the knife, and after the knife was two different people, two different things. There was a transformation in Abraham. Well, that's a great explanation, except that Torah seems to refute me. It says, the angel came to Abraham, Vayomer, Bi nishbati ne'um Adonai. I'm giving you an oath in the name of God. Because you have done this, because you have not withheld your son, your favorite son from me. So I'm going to give you a great blessing. You're going to have great descendants. You're going to be multiplied, all kinds of good blessings. So it looks like the blessing came because Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, and says, V'lo chasachta et bincha, you did not hold back your son, and that proves that you really have faith in God. Now, that's a good interpretation, no objection, and everyone's welcome to keep that. But I looked at the words more carefully. Lo chasachta, you have not withheld your son. The word chasachta has exactly the same letters as the word choshech, darkness. In other words, what I would read this verse to say is this: Abraham, you had darkness in your eyes. You didn't see the greatness of Yitzhak. All the time that you raised him, you always were looking at Ishmael. You never really focused. I gave you 3 days to spend time with him, and you didn't really get it. Only when you were about to lose him, you suddenly got it, how important he is. Now you have taken the blindfold off your eyes because your eyes are no longer dark in seeing Yitzhak. Now that you appreciate him, then you're going to get this blessing and you'll have all these descendants, etc., etc. Well, that's very good. Now, how can I prove that I'm telling you the good interpretation? Well, what happens right after Abraham gets this blessing? He notices that there is a ram caught in the bushes by the horn. And that's how he used to have the shofar, because it's a ram's horn. And he sacrifices the ram instead. Ladies and gentlemen, how long was that ram there? Did it just show up after the sacrifice? Or was it there all along? Chances are, if the ram got as tangled up in the bushes, it was there the whole time. But you know what? Abraham didn't see it. Abraham's eyes were closed. He didn't see what right in front of his face. Once the sacrifice of Isaac didn't have to take place, once he started to appreciate Isaac, then he opened his eyes, just, hey, there's a ram there, I'll bring the ram instead. Now, sounds like it's a far-fetched explanation that I gave you, but there's a little passage in the Pirkei Avot, which somehow or other people don't pay attention to. It's chapter 5 of Mishnah 6. The Mishnah tells us that on the eve of the Sabbath of the creation, the 6th day of the creation, just before it got dark, God created 10 things. Created the donkey that spoke to Bilam, he made the man, he made the rainbow, he made other miracles happen. What is the explanation of this? According to Rambam, it makes sense. God had certain miracles like that was going to perform, like the earth was going to open up and swallow up Korach and his family. So God already prepared that from the time of creation. Those miracles that happened actually are part of nature. They were already built into nature from the very beginning. They look like a miracle and they were miraculous, but they were already pre-planned. God already pre-programmed the world to open up the earth at that time or to have a donkey that talks for Bilam, etc., etc. But then it says, among other things, the grave of Moses, which people also ignore. I mean, God knew Moses was not going to go to the promised land. God already prepared the grave for him, not in the promised land. So we read the story of the Torah, it looks like Moses is getting punished. God knew ahead of time. Moses is never going to make it to the promised land. The grave was already prepared for him. People don't pay attention to that fact, this Mishnah. But then also the ram of Abraham, our father. God already knew Abraham wasn't going to sacrifice Isaac. God was already sure that this was never going to happen. But what did he want? He wanted to put the ram there from the very beginning of history, the beginning of creation, and Abraham was going to find it. The Mishnah is basically agreeing with me, I think. The Mishnah is saying the ram was always there. The situation had already been pre-planned. Abraham might not have realized it, but it was already pre-planned. So what did Abraham do? When Abraham almost lost his son, then his eyes opened, and then he went to that ram and he sacrificed the ram instead of his son. Some people don't like the idea of animal sacrifices. I know we're not keen on animal sacrifices, but in those days that was common. Let me go back to another thing. In those days, when Abraham was commanded to sacrifice his son, when we read it, was so shocking. God's going to ask someone to sacrifice their son? What kind of primitive thing is this? In those days, that was fairly common, by the way, apparently. That's what I read. In those child sacrifice was, if you really love God, you sacrifice your child. They had a whole tribe, Molech. They used to bring their children and put them in the fire. They used to think that's the ultimate a sign of faith, is if I could love God so much, I love him more than my own child. So that's a sign of love. So when Abraham got this commandment, it wasn't out of left field, such a strange commandment. It was something that he might have known about it. That was what people did. Okay, God's asking me to sacrifice. Okay, I'm going to sacrifice. But the strange thing is God told him ahead of time, you're going to have a son through your wife Sarah, and your descendants are going to come through that son. God told that to Abraham. Then he comes and says, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. So why didn't Abraham just say, God, you told me that Sarah's going to have this son. She has a son. You told me that all my descendants are going to come through this son. What are you telling me to kill it for? How could I kill the son? You yourself told me. The answer is Abraham knew himself he's not going to kill his son. Abraham knows that God's not going to bluff. God told him his descendants would come through Isaac. So in my reading of the story, it's God is trying to get Abraham to realize that sometimes great leadership comes not from great, strong military people or from tyrants or from Putins. Greatness comes from quiet types. You need different kinds of leadership for different generations. So God was trying to say, Abraham, you're a big, powerful man. You're a great man, charismatic. You and your wife are terrific people. And Isaac doesn't live up to your same character. But you know what? For this next generation, we need Isaac. Isaac's going to be your successor. And Isaac will have a son, and his son will be Jacob, and the children of Israel will come out of that. But Abraham didn't know that at the beginning. Abraham was putting his faith in Ishmael. In fact, when God told Abraham, sacrifice Isaac, this is pure speculation on my part, Abraham might have said, good, I can get rid of this kid and I'll bring Ishmael back, right? That might, I don't know how to read Abraham's mind. I'm probably reading too much into it, but it's plausible that since Abraham had such a strong attachment to Ishmael, and Ishmael seemed to be a better successor, he may very well have been saying, okay, good, maybe it's good to get rid of Isaac and I'll get Ishmael. But the Akedah, what did it do? It taught Abraham, God did choose Isaac. Isaac is worthy. And Abraham, now that you've spent some time with him and you're all just about ready to lose him, now you can appreciate his value and now work with him and start building the next generation. The story, when it says they returned, is very interesting. It says, Vayashav Aram el Na'arav, and Abraham returned to his servants. He had brought servants with him and left them behind. And they got together and they went back to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelled in Beersheba. Interestingly, it doesn't say Abraham and Isaac went back to Beersheba. It says, Vayashav Avraham el Na'arav. Abraham returned to his servants. It doesn't say Vayashav Avraham, Yashuvu Avraham Yitzchak. So where's Yitzchak? There's a Vayakumu, and they got up, but that could be him and his servants. Vayadechu yachdav el Beersheba. So I think because it says Vayadechu yachdav, that phrase was used before only in context of Abraham and Isaac. Vayadechu shneim yachdav, that was used in context. So the Torah here is alluding to the fact that Abraham is walking together with Yitzchak as one. You don't even have to mention anything. Like they become one unit before. Before, when they were coming, when they were coming to the Akedah, they're still on the road. The Torah says 2 times, they both were walking together. Physically, they were together. They were next to each other, but they weren't united in spirit necessarily. By the end, after Abraham appreciated Yitzchak, then they became as one unit. They became as a solidified team. So that's what I have to say about the Akedah for today. And give it some thought. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. I think it does. And it puts the whole story in a different context, but there's a moral lesson in it. The moral lesson, which I said really before, is we often don't appreciate or don't properly estimate the people that are closest to us. We don't appreciate them till they're gone or they're almost gone. And that's really what the lesson is. Abraham had a knife at his son's throat before he appreciated what was what. I think if the angel didn't come down, Abraham might very well have sacrificed him. But my theory is he wouldn't have. As soon as he put the knife at the throat and he realized, Abraham, he said, I'm not going to sacrifice this kid. It's too much for me. I now appreciate this boy. I'm not going to sacrifice him. He would have stopped even without the angel coming down. But that's speculation. So that's something to think about. And when we read the story and when we sing the 8 Rosh Hashanah, obviously the story has developed different emotional outlets in different ways. And all those things are fine. The way I'm explaining the story is good, but the traditional way of understanding it is also good and has other values to it. I'd like to wish you all a wonderful day, good health, happiness, strength, peace in Israel, peace in the world. And we hope the situation in Ukraine settles down sooner rather than later. And we pray for all good things. We should get together for happy things very, very soon. All right.
Amen.
So take care, and we love you all, and we should see you all.
Toda.
in good health.
Toda. Thank you.
Thank
Have a good
you.
day.
So much. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Good day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Rabbi.
Okay, bye-bye.